Good afternoon, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Water in a Warming World series. Thank you all for joining us, and many thanks to our generous sponsors from Iron Horse Vineyards and Spotswoods Estate Vineyard and Winery for supporting this webinar series, and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. I'm Daniel Mountjoy, and I'm the Director of Resource Stewardship at Sustainable Conservation. For those of you that don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping California thrive by uniting people to solve the toughest challenges facing our land, air, and water. Every day, we bring together businesses, landowners, government, water agencies, nonprofits, and others to steward the resources that we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. Today's presentation will be about an hour and a half, and we'll have time for audience questions at the end. As your questions come up, please type them into the Q&A box you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and know that we'll try to get to everyone's questions at the end. Today's topic is fortifying California's water resilience, or water resiliency. We'll be discussing how to prepare for the next flood year and how to be better prepared for the next inevitable drought, if that's in fact what we're in this year. And all of these require advanced thinking and advanced planning. As many of you know, Sustainable Conservation has been working to find solutions to California's water issues for many years. Our Accelerating Restoration program has been expanding its impact for 25 years by simplifying the permitting process for projects that restore and enhance our state's rivers, streams, and wetland habitats. These aquatic systems are under increasing strain as our climate changes. Our partners at resource conservation districts, land trusts, and other NGOs like the Nature Conservancy are planning projects to accommodate increased flooding and ensure that species survival can occur during prolonged droughts. We're going to hear more about this from our panelist, Sandy Matsumoto, during this panel. Our dairies and water quality team is working to reduce water demand and use on dairies, and thereby reduce leaching of excess nutrients into the groundwater that agriculture and communities rely on, especially heavily during droughts. And our Water for the Future program on the Central Coast is working with agricultural industry to improve irrigation and nutrient efficiency so that we protect our vital coastal watersheds and aquifers for drinking water and sustained agricultural production as water availability on the surface changes. And our Central Valley Recharge program has been working for 10 years to evaluate and expand the capturing of peak flood flows on farmlands, such as Don Cameron's, in wet years to replenish our aquifers. You'll hear more about the importance of this approach from both Jenny and Don during our presentation today. Managing water in a warming world will require significant collaboration. As Tim Quinn, the former executive director at the Association of California Water Agencies, recently pointed out, we solved many of our water needs in the first half of the last century through big water development. Then starting in the 1970s, we relied on regulations to solve the environmental water problems we'd created. We're now in an era where collaboration is going to be necessary, since so many of the water challenges we face are interconnected. Water for farming, for communities, and the environment is limited, and we need to work together to adapt to a warming world. I'm now going to introduce our panelists and how we have all worked together on these pressing water issues. I'm going to introduce them in sort of the reverse order of their presentations because this is how we've gotten to know these folks. Don Cameron. Don brought the concept of on-farm recharge to the water world. He's the vice president and general manager of Terra Nova Ranch Incorporated in Fresno County. Don invited Phil Bashand and Sustainable Conservation to document how he's reduced flood risk by taking water onto his farm for many decades. He's worried, he is worried and then inspired many of his neighboring farmers about this approach, and now they're following suit. He also serves as president of California State Board of Food and Agriculture. Sandy Matsumoto, as the California Water Program Director at the Nature Conservancy, Sandy leads a team of scientists and project managers who have led innovative water management strategies throughout the state. They've integrated migratory bird and wetland needs with salmon rearing habitat and rice farming, and now with groundwater recharge. She also serves as a board member on the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. We work with several members of Sandy's team on exploring ways to achieve recharge and maintain farming and enhance wildlife benefits at the same time. And then last, but who's going to present first, is Jenny Marr, Supervising Engineer at the California Department of Water Resources. Jenny is a collaborative innovator who's been instrumental in the state's flood management planning. She's also helped develop the concept of FloodMAR, or Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, not named after her last name, but a very appropriate name. We collaborate with Jenny in leading the FloodMAR network, and through Jenny, DWR is funding sustainable conservation to develop 6 new pilot recharge projects at the farm and irrigation district level. This panel will now take us through the interrelated water management world of flood risk management, floodplain restoration, groundwater recharge, and the importance of taking a multi-benefit approach to these issues in this changing climate. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who's really going to give us some background for all of the discussions and presentations you're soon to see. Jenny, welcome.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it. Let me share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. As Daniel indicated, I'm Jenny Marr with the Department of Water Resources. I'm really happy to be here today and be part of this conversation. Daniel asked me to answer the question, how do we manage floodwaters in a changing climate? So I'm going to first start with a little context. So this graph shows California's annual average temperature along the x-axis on the bottom, and precipitation accumulation along the y-axis on the left. The yellow triangle near the middle is the average across years. The blue circles are yearly data from the 1900s. The squares are data from the last 20 years. The squares show that average temperatures in the last 20 years are generally trending warmer, that most of these squares are moving towards the right of the graph. This is something we're experiencing now, not just something that we're planning for in the future. It's here and now. The graph also illustrates that precipitation is still variable year to year, and that variability is pretty normal for California water managers. So this graph shows over the last 50 years, times we've been in flood and times we've been in drought. So this variability in precipitation is normal. We've experienced it before. Water extremes are not new. Droughts and flood are a way of life in California, and we've experienced both in our lifetimes. But with climate change, we're anticipating that these extremes are greater and more often. So, we're going to see some changes in that variability and intensity. We also expect that warming will result in increasing and changing the timing of runoff and affect our ability to store water so we can use it later. Higher runoff increases our risk of flooding, since we have a greater volume of water entering our river systems than before. Our current water system is designed to slowly receive water by mostly snowmelt, which is different than what we're expecting with climate change. We're expecting to get more intense precipitation as rain in shorter periods. And what we're learning is all water sectors are vulnerable to climate change. For example, we're expecting flood risks to increase. Water demand will increase with temperature. Water supplies will be less reliable, and our ecosystems will be further stressed by water availability, timing, and temperature. For example, in the Central Valley, this graphic shows climate change impacts on flood flows from the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. The big takeaway from this graphic is flood volumes are expected to increase with warming temperature, and the San Joaquin watershed is particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts due to the higher elevation of the watershed. So how do we manage increasing flood risk in a changing climate? And I think there's three major areas of focus. One is systems thinking. The second is nature-based solutions. The Army Corps, the United States Army Corps of Engineers calls this engineering with nature. And the third is wise use of floodplains. And I'll briefly talk about each of these in the next few slides. So systems thinking. Systems thinking examples include multi-sector, watershed scale resilience planning and management, using a headwaters to groundwater approach, such as using floodwater for managed aquifer recharge on working lands and natural managed lands, which we call floodmar, and reoperating reservoirs and co-managing surface and groundwater storage. Floodmar, as I said, is using high flows using high flows from or in anticipation of rainfall or snowmelt, and putting that water in that ground, into the ground through managed aquifer recharge. And we talk about floodmar on agricultural lands, working landscapes, and natural managed lands. I am a project manager in the floodmar program at DWR, and we really are excited about the potential for floodmar. Floodmar is voluntary, so we work with willing landowners in public-private partnerships to develop floodmar projects. It's multi-sector, so we're talking about co-managing flood, surface, groundwater, ecosystem, water quality aspects of the water system. It's scalable, so a floodmar project could occur on farm with one landowner, or it could be district-wide, watershed-wide, and including multiple landowners and stakeholders. It's also multifaceted. This graphic kind of shows that headwaters to groundwater approach, and that any of these different operations could be included in a floodmar scheme. What's really exciting about floodmar is that it can be planned for lots of different public benefits, including flood risk reduction, drought preparedness, aquifer replenishment, ecosystem enhancement, groundwater quality remediation, working land stewardship and preservation, climate change adaptation, recreation. You can really think of this as an integrated water resource management strategy. So reservoir reoperation is another one of the systems thinking focus areas for thinking about how to manage floodwaters in a changing climate. Surface water storage can be a polarizing topic, but with the loss of snowpack storage, existing surface storage in reservoirs provides a critical role in attenuating high flows and metering water into our river systems. Throughout their winter, reservoirs provide critical flood control storage space and allow for managing the timing of releases to reduce flood risk, manage environmental flows, and increase water supply reliability. Reservoirs can be reoperated to better emulate natural flow regimes with various climate futures and to optimize coordinated surface and groundwater management. Two example ways that reservoir operations could support multiple benefit watershed management and better manage high flow events are: one, this recharge pool concept, which is the pre-release of water from a reservoir early in the winter season to be moved for recharge into groundwater storage, and refilling the vacated surface storage space during the winter months as inflows become available. And the second is forecast-informed reservoir operations, and sometimes that's referred to as FIRO. Forecast-informed reservoir operations can work in two ways. One, creating more flood space when large precipitation events are forecasted to increase flood control space. Or two, holding more water in storage when there isn't precipitation forecasted to preserve water for water supply when we're experiencing a drier period. Another focus area for managing flood flows during in a changing climate is nature-based solutions. And there's really two facets to this: capture rainfall where it lands. That for some examples are greenways, or stormwater parks or rain gardens in your yard. Another is manage the flood system in ways that are compatible with natural processes. So that means restoration of wetlands, of our riverine systems, utilizing solutions like levee setbacks, bypasses, and restoring floodplains. And lastly, that third focus area is wise use of floodplains. Some examples of that is really looking at preserving and enhancing land use in agricultural production, natural or other non-urban uses that avoid risk intensification and life loss when floods do happen. And some examples include multi-benefit transitory storage and recharge basins, flood compatible agricultural, so managing agricultural lands for periodic flooding, and restored floodplain habitat. And with kind of that context, I'll let Sandy and Don expand on some of these concepts. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And can I just ask you to just briefly explain what the transitory storage concept is? Because I imagine most folks don't know what that refers to.
Yeah, transitory storage is temporary storage in a floodplain. So, very similar to the concept of a detention basin, but on a pretty large scale, especially when we're doing flood planning for the Central Valley. And so it's taking water off of the riverine system, storing it in what we call transitory storage space, temporary storage space, which would be a large detention basin, and then metering it out after peak flows have passed. And the idea of planning multi-benefit transitory storage is that it's not just a basin, but it can be planned for recharge. It can be planned for habitat purposes. It could also be complementary with ag uses. So it's really thinking about how to plan for temporary, pretty deep flooding.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And if any of the audience, you have questions about any of the concepts or terms shared here in these presentations, please use the Q&A and put your questions in, and we'll come back to covering those, or I will catch our speakers before they move on and answer those questions. We don't want you to get left behind in the discussion, because these presentations do in some ways build on one another. So we'll turn now to Sandy. Thank you, Sandy, for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having me. These webinars by SESCON are always super helpful, and so I'm honored to be a part of it today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature-based solutions that Jenny just mentioned. I have examples to get into. But just to kind of re-emphasize some of the problem that we have is basically, if you think about our system, we built most of our water management system in the 20th century, and it was suited to that part of the cycle that Jenny showed, that was, has drought and dry periods and wet periods, but spaced out further along. And we're now facing these periods where we're having multiple years back to back of these dry periods. And so as we saw this year, for example, the reservoirs that we have across the state with a lot of capacity are actually, many of them are sitting at really low levels, because we didn't have the anticipated snow melt off that we usually have. And so these solutions that we built for 20th century solutions to the 20th century problems are really ill suited for what we're seeing going forward, because the hydrology is going to be so much more intense. We really need to be thinking about a new solution set. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, is sort of building on the system that we have and really adapting towards 21st century hydrology that will be kind of, the closer, the waves happening more intensely and more in shorter periods of time. I think, what we learned from the drought is, and with the recent announcement, the state water project will be at 0% allocations, is the system's not working for the communities, right? So there's 27 million people who rely on the state water project. And at this point, the water supply outlook is not looking good because of the La Nina outlook that we have and the current status of storage. Similarly, in our natural systems, we're facing some really dire circumstances. And this is not one of my doom and gloom presentations. I do lots of those, but I just wanted to just provide a couple of data points for just to set the context. Before drought conditions, so this is pre even the last drought, one in every 2 species that depend on freshwater in California were on a trajectory to be at risk of extinction during our children's lifetime. So that's an astounding number, and one that keeps me very motivated to do my job. And we're also seeing evidence of this already in this really current drought, which is that, our scientists are looking at what's happening in our rivers, and it's very possible that our winter run and even our spring run Chinook could be going extinct because of the conditions that are in streams right now. So we are really at this crossroads here in California where we have to make the transition to the 21st century and think about managing our system differently, both because our communities are suffering as well as our ecosystems that depend on them. So I want to kind of get into the solution set, right? So we've got some the problems of the 20th century are the same in the 21st century. It's just they're going to be more intense. We're going to have to reduce our flood risk because we have communities and property near rivers. And so what I would posit is let's let rivers be rivers, and we'll go into that solution set. Similarly, we have water supply issues. We need to increase our water supply. And as Jenny mentioned, different forms of managed aquifer recharge, in particular, the forms that have multiple benefits, is a really promising area that actually can be done at lower costs than a lot of traditional supply and storage projects. And then finally, the really hard part about what we need to do in water in California is reduce our water use. At the end of the day, the amount of water we're using is not sustainable into the future, and we're already seeing that. And so we need to figure out a way to get some of the current water uses retired. And so I wanted to offer one option to help with that process that could be also helpful in recovering some listed species. So I'll go through each of these in turn. So starting with the floodplain problem, I think well known in California, we have many communities that face a lot of flood risk, especially when we have big rain events. And I wanted to share an example that comes out of Ventura County. This is actually where I got my start in conservation. What you're looking at here is the Santa Clara River. It's a system that flows through from the headwaters are in LA County, and it flows through Ventura County. And as you can see, the river is quite wide. It's a beautiful landscape with the river cutting through this amazing and very diverse agricultural powerhouse. And the way that we've been able to ensure that this river doesn't do too much damage to property is basically by giving the river room. And what happened was a big coalition of folks came together, included NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, Ventura County Flood Protection District, the Farm Bureau, and others, and really started looking at what was projected to happen in the county. And so they did the Watershed Protection District did a study, and it looked like the projected development that was anticipated in the county, that another 21,000 homes could face severe flood risk and a cost of over $1 billion in potential damages. And so they started looking for different ways of dealing with that flood risk. And in traditional ways, if you think about ways that people have protected basically civilizations from rivers, it has been to develop hardline levees and just basically to protect the bank. The problem is that as soon as you protect one part of the river, especially in a system as dynamic as the Santa Clara River, you create a hard edge on one side, and it basically forces the river to ricochet over to the other side, causing you to have to then harden the levee on the other side of the river, and so on and so forth until you basically have channelized the entire system. Now, doing that is extraordinarily expensive. Based on some 2016 estimates down in Ventura, they were looking at the cost of like a 5,000 foot levee at over $10 million. And so if you have miles and miles of this type of levee and hardening, it's extraordinarily expensive. And doesn't even, that capital cost doesn't even include the annual operation and maintenance costs associated with those types of infrastructure solutions. So the group began looking at the alternative, which is basically to start acquiring flood easements. So flood easements as an alternative, as opposed to the $10 million price tag for 5,000 feet of protection, cost only $2.2 million. So it's about 20%, a little over 20% of the cost of the hardened solution. And so as a coalition, they came together in 2013 and secured grants and have already started this program where they're basically acquiring easements from willing landowners to allow the floodplain to expand when the river is running hard. What this has done has actually benefited the entire county. So when folks go to buy flood insurance from FEMA, the costs are based on, there's a calculation that's made, and it's based on a number of attributes, one of which is the degree to which the floodplain is allowed to be open and available for flooding. And because of the work that's been done through conservation entities, as well as through this floodplain easement program, they're looking at rates that the calculation that goes into setting rates has resulted in a 25% reduction in flood insurance. So it's been a benefit to all the residents in Ventura County. The second place I want to kind of talk about where nature can be a solution is around that water supply problem. So what you're looking at here are some fields. These are rice fields up in the Sacramento Valley, and these white clumps are actually birds. So these are birds that have gone to fields that we've flooded on purpose to create migratory bird habitat, and then more recently also to facilitate groundwater recharge. And so more broadly in the Sacramento Valley, we've been looking for places that have the types of soils where we can actually start to sink water back into the aquifer. And so through a partnership with the CLUSA Groundwater Authority, we've actually been able to quantify actual recharge that's happening, benefiting the surrounding farmers and communities, but also creating important migratory bird habitat during the specific weeks when the birds are in need of that habitat. This program is being expanded pretty aggressively. We've got a lot of partners now working on it, including the California Rights Commission, Audubon California, Point Blue Conservation Science, and others. And then with funding, actually, with drought response funding from the state, both Department of Water Resources and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we're doing kind of a surge program this year. And so we're anticipating almost 500 or 50,000 acres being put out this year for bird habitat. Some of that will be specifically for recharge purposes, but it's a really exciting program that kind of gets at that, both at helping the birds at the time they're needing it, and in places where the soils are conducive to it, we're also doing recharge. And then, as Jenny mentioned, we're also looking at starting to use flood waters for this type of program. And work that Daniel and his team are doing and others is really exciting to try to harness some of the big flood flows. Now, all of this sounds great and kind of conceptually, and it's beautiful from the perspective if you're a bird lover, but it also makes sense if you just care about money. And so we've done some work to quantify how much these practices cost, and actually with some help from sustainable conservation, we've kind of looked across the spectrum of ways that you can increase water supply and store water in the state of California. And based on some literature reviews and other work that our scientists have done, what we're really seeing is that these practices that are on farm are by far cheaper. They're costing in the tens of dollars in terms of acre foot recharge versus some of the more traditional practices to get water stored and create water supply, which cost in the thousands and tens of thousands of dollars. So huge benefit to doing these things, and really it makes a lot of practical sense when you think about the surface of our Central Valley is predominantly farmland. And so doing things on the farmland when those big flood flows come through, I think we're seeing it both for a benefit from an environmental perspective, but also for water supply and just economic sense. So the final piece that I wanted to talk about is just this really tough problem of needing to reduce our water usage. And this is being driven a lot by Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The Public Policy Institute of California estimates that some 500,000 acres of irrigated agriculture may need to come out of production to achieve groundwater sustainability. And this creates a really big challenge for how we make a transition from irrigated agriculture. One of the possible alternatives is restoring that land to arid upland habitat. So this habitat is native scrub that does not need to be irrigated and can serve as an alternative to what could potentially become a weed and a dust nuisance in the valley for surrounding farmers. So it's one of the possible solution sets that the Nature Conservancy is putting forward. We published a book on this, and the great news now is that the State Department of Conservation has a program to help farmers who are willing to try this and other alternative land uses under a land repurposing program that's being funded in its initial year with $50 million. So it's $50 million that's about to that will be going out to the ground to help facilitate this really difficult transition. So just in summary, I think it really comes down to two things. Getting to the 21st century solution set that we're looking for is looking to nature to do its thing and working with our collaborators. We have tons of folks, especially in the NGO community, who are willing to step up and collaborate with partners on the ground. And so now I want to turn it over to one of our important collaborators, which is agriculture. And I think that's a good transition to Dawn. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. So now we'll hear from Dawn, who's practiced it on the ground and thought about it and talked about it at the state level and policy levels. So look forward to your perspective, Don.
Thank you, Daniel. Really great to be here today with our group, really fantastic group to work with. So my name is Don Cameron, and I farm in the central San Joaquin Valley. We have a multitude of crops, around 25 different crops. We farm organic and conventionally, and we are almost entirely dependent upon groundwater for our farming operation here. Next slide. So as farmers, we've seen the changes. We know it's real and we know it's here. You know, we've been dealing with the extremes for quite some time. But if you look at the last 7 years, or pardon me, the last 10 years, 7 of them have been drought and 3 of them have been flood. You know, what we're seeing on farm is crops are being affected by the increase in temperature that we've seen over the summers, and you know, and the droughts and the floods have definitely become more extreme. This is just a chart similar to Jenny's, but it shows the extremes in rainfall events and you know, year by year for the last 100 years, and you can see the extremes are getting bigger. And like I say, we're seeing that in our own crops that we grow here. Next slide. So most of our farming takes place within the McMullen area GSA. That is highlighted in yellow. The blue on the western side is the North Fork of the Kings River. And the north side is the boundary is the San Joaquin River.
Don, I'm just sorry, can you explain what a GSA is?
Thank you, Daniel. Yep, a GSA is a groundwater sustainability agency that has been formed throughout California in critically overdrafted basins such as ours, and also in moderately overdrafted basins. And it administers the extraction of groundwater throughout the area that it administers, and is responsible for obtaining sustainable level of groundwater by 2040. So there's a 20-year period of transition to get from where we were. Really, when we also submitted plans to the state, and we're actually waiting for our plan to come back so that we can see whether we fulfilled the needs of sustainable groundwater management. But that is a new entity throughout California, and these groundwater sustainability agencies have the power to tax or charge the growers for the services that they provide. In our groundwater sustainability agency, we pay $19 per acre per year. for administration and development of our plans and the implementation of plans. Next slide. So at Terra Nova, I've been working on groundwater recharge and floodwater capture for over 30 years. I've been farming for 40 years, but have really concentrated on capturing floodwater, bringing it on farm and spreading it or using it in lieu of pumping. So this was our initial attempt at floodwater capture from the Kings River, a 1 mile canal. It took $27,000 to build, and from start to finish, it took 3 weeks. And as you can understand, there really wasn't permitting involved in this. But this is what we did in a very rapid period. And we were able to bring water on farm, pump it into our legacy pipelines that we used to use for flood irrigation. That they're pretty idle right now. They're rarely used because we either do subsurface drip irrigation or above surface drip irrigation or high efficiency sprinklers on the crops that need that. But this just shows, what we did early on, way before sustainable groundwater management. We've been involved trying to figure out a way to bring floodwater on farm, distribute it, and either use it for irrigation or for groundwater recharge. Next slide. So we actually started with a small grant, a $75,000 grant from Natural Resource Conservation that we received in 2010. And we put it into practice in 2011. And lo and behold, we had floodwater in 2011. We were able to measure groundwater recharge in vineyards that we applied water to for a period of over 5 months. This was early on. Since then, we've actually now built the infrastructure, the primary 2 legs of the infrastructure that starts in the lower left near the Kings River bypass. The blue line that comes up, and then it goes to 1 mile for the east and 1.5 miles to the north. And this is the preliminary infrastructure that will be used and expanded on in the future, but we kept it mainly within our farming operation so that we could work better with the people we're dealing with on this and get it in place and get it moving. The only problem is this was a $5 million grant with a $2 million match. And in the 10 years that it took to build it, we ended up spending $13 million to get this actually built and ready to convey water. You've got to remember the entire 120,000 acres within our groundwater sustainability agency had no surface water, had no conveyance, had no canals, had no structures in place. So it's like starting a new irrigation district from ground zero. And we built these initial canals large because we knew we wanted to capture floodwater when it was available. And as we know, floodwater comes in shorter periods, but in large quantities. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just showing the head gates that were part of the project. This is where the water actually enters from the Kings River into the new canal that we've built behind here. As I said, there was nothing here before. Now we have some substantial infrastructure to be able to take water when it is available. Next slide. So as you heard earlier, we did partner with Sustainable Conservation for part of our project. And I think this was probably the first water distribution system for managed aquifer recharge in the state. Phase 1 was built with 6,500 acres, but phase 2 and phase 3, which are already being staked out, and easements will be purchased to move water an additional 7 miles to the east and encompass another 20,000 acres. So this is the beginning of a large project, and we know that it's expensive. Our GSA was able to obtain a $10 million State Water Resources Control Board grant, and the local water district was able to get a $7 million grant from Natural Resources Agency, which is a federal program. So we combine them, we have 17 million to expand the project. But really, we need a lot more. This is just the beginning. But we know that we can push at least 500 cubic feet per second, which is equivalent to 1,000 acres with 1 foot of water per day being applied. So the system is robust. It's able to handle flood flows when they do come. And like I say, we hope to spread these not only on growing crops, which I'll show you in a minute, but also in some of the basins that we've put on the farm that will be used for crop production during dry years and flooded during wet years. Next slide. And this is really how we did it. We started flooding wine grapes. I had a lot of confidence in this idea back in 2011 when we were looking for additional ground to put water on. Suggested that we flood our wine grapes. And like I say, Daniel knows very well, but our neighbors thought we were crazy. They thought we were going to be killing our vines, and there was a lot of skepticism. We started the water in February and we ended it in late June. And this field, we were able to put 13 feet of water on these wine grapes. We pulled the water in late June. We harvested them in August without any problems. And we've done this over the couple other flood periods that we've had. So we know it works, or we knew in 2011 that we could do it. And we also, at the same time, we had sensors nearby, and we saw an increase of 40 feet of additional height in our groundwater supply, which makes perfect sense. So next slide. So we got a little more daring, and the next flood we had was in 2017. And we started flooding the other permanent crops that we have. We have pistachios, which are shown on the left. We have almonds on the right. And we flooded those for a long period of time. We had a high water mark in the pistachios there of about 2.5 feet, which, to be honest with you, I thought pistachios would be a little more temperamental than the wine grapes. And the almonds, we watched carefully. And when any winds were predicted, we backed off on the water because that can be a risk. You could have trees blowing down. But to my surprise, everything came through this well. And we also flooded almonds. We had some, we flooded olives and also walnuts in this project as well. And all of them are doing extremely well. Has not been a problem. I'm not saying there can't be problems. I think growers need to really watch what they do and when they do it, and not just put water on and walk away. Next slide. So I want to touch on this because this is a large project that our GSA is working on currently. And it fits into the canals that we're already building now, but this is for an Aquaterra water bank, since we have access to the Mendota Pool and to the Kings River and to the San Joaquin River. We think that this area is well suited for a groundwater bank. we know that we can really store up to 1.8 million acre feet, which is larger than most of the reservoirs in California. And we can store it underground, and we can retrieve it. We can bring other people's water in here during high water years, store it, and then take it back out during drought periods. Not only for agriculture, but for cities as well that have an issue with water storage and water reliability. The reason we have such a tremendous area to store water, unfortunately, is because the area has been pumped so hard for so many years that we actually have a cone of depression. In other words, a bowl that the water really won't escape until it gets extremely high in our underground level, which, you know, could take quite a while. But anyway, this is something else we're working on, something to stabilize groundwater levels and actually increase groundwater levels within our groundwater sustainability agency. Next slide. So if we don't do anything at all, you've heard there is money for land repurposing. But you know, as farmers, we really don't like the idea of fallowing. And that will be probably the last resort. You know, we know that when we do fallow land and take it out of production, the local community suffers. Jobs are lost. We also, you know, we'll see higher prices for food. I mean, what we grow, if we grow it abundantly, keeps the prices down. When we start cutting back on farmland, prices will rise, just as they have with shortages of water that we're facing currently. But one other thing that we really haven't talked about a lot is the air quality will be diminished unless we do have something on that ground. This is a shot, honestly, it's of our farm. We had a high wind period earlier this year, and it's a real telling example of what can happen when we start taking fields out of production. And one other effect that I hadn't even thought about that was brought up with a meeting I had with our local Fresno County Health Department, and that's the increased incidence of valley fever, because valley fever is tied to dusty, windy conditions, dry soil, and they said that they have correlated rainfall to valley fever infections here in the San Joaquin Valley, which I was fairly surprised to hear. I always knew it was out there, always in the background, but you know, if we're going to see areas like this in the future, the risks are going to be multiplied. So I think with that, I'll let you take over, Daniel. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Don, for covering several important topics there, including water banking and other implications. We had a question around what does 500,000 acre feet, what does 500,000 acres out of production mean? And I did answer that in terms of the total acres in the valley being 4.2 million acre feet in the San Joaquin Valley. So we're talking about 12% of the acreage potentially going out of production. And you know, Don, you talked about the dust impacts if that was just to occur randomly. And Sandy, you talked about the importance of establishing habitat on that for purposes of both dust control and habitat creation. Well, first of all, let me just say that you can see why this group of folks is so great to work with here at Sustainable Conservation. We really enjoy the creative solutions that this kind of a group brings together, the attentiveness to cost implications of these kinds of solutions, and the fact that we're building on natural processes rather than trying to control nature. And I think those are all sort of characteristics of what Sustainable Conservation is doing and that we share with all of these partners. There's a couple of questions that have come in so far. And again, for those of you that have questions, go ahead and keep them coming through the question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. There was a general question here about water conservation. And I think, Sandy, you had a slide that showed that water conservation is more expensive than recharge. Arthur asked a question about that, and that's sort of short question. Maybe can you explain that one? Because certainly conservation and demand reduction is an important part of the solution here.
Sure. Yeah, I think some water conservation that we can take in our homes is easy, right? It's take a shorter shower. That's fairly free. I mean, I actually arguably would save money because you're using less water. Some of the big things though that change our water use, especially in more residential areas, are pretty expensive, right? So you think about like, I'm dying to redo my yard, but it's cost prohibitive. It's very expensive to pull things out, put in different kind of landscaping, and do those kinds of big water use changing types of things. And so often the places where those water conservation measures are more successful, especially those are really successful in Southern California, where they have a lot of funding basically to pay consumers to make those types of transitions. So starting talking about low flow toilets and different shower heads, but the big thing becomes what goes on in the yard, and that yard transition for folks, especially if they're sitting on a big green lawn, can be fairly expensive. So I think the urban conservation piece of it includes all of those things. It was a range of those types of actions. I think that initial part, and you'll see this even when water conservation measures come out, that first like 5%, 10%, you can get, it's fairly easy because you take a shorter shower. People can do things that can do that, but if you want to sustain it over the long run and get to the bigger numbers, it gets quite a bit more expensive because it requires physical changes within the residential footprint. And that's what drives kind of some of those high. Contrast that with the farm is sitting out there already, right? And it's a big open space. And if you can, a lot of the work, for example, that Daniel and his team are doing, a lot of other NGOs that work in the agricultural landscape, a lot of what we do is try to figure out when are those fields idle and when is it okay to put water out there. And so that the cost is basically, if you can get the water and throw it out on the landscape, it's pretty low cost. There is some work required by the farmer. There's labor involved. Sometimes there's field prep. There's definitely water management. It's not, as Dawn said, you can't just put it out there and let it go. So there are some costs, but just when you compare that and the volume of water that you can do out on the farming landscape versus what you can do in the individual household, that accounts for the difference.
Thank you, Sandy. And we've done those cost studies with Dawn and other growers where the price per acre foot stored is in the $40 to $100, depending on whether they have to pump or install new flood irrigation, irrigation system, sort of similar to like the lawn landscaping system, changing that plumbing. If you have to change the plumbing, where a grower has attempted to do water conservation by putting in drip irrigation and micro sprinklers, what we've found is those systems are incredibly effective at conserving water during dry years, but they prohibit us from being able to do these really large recharge events. So some farmers have to go back in and install flood irrigation systems to take the big gulp of flood water that's necessary to reduce the flood risk and achieve the groundwater recharge. So that's where the costs maybe go up to $100 an acre foot. But when you start to think about the cost of new reservoirs in the tens of thousands of dollars per acre foot, it's extremely affordable. There was another conservation question, Jenny, that maybe you could answer from Clyde, which is DWR proposing water conservation such as a change from perennial to annual cropping? And the importance here of annual cropping, I don't know if Clyde's implying it here, but that when you have annual cropland, you have a lot more flexibility on when you can put water on that land, because you may not have crop management operations that may get in the way of the timing. But Jenny, what's the DWR's thoughts on this type of thing? How do you approach it?
From a Floodmar perspective, annual cropping does have that water management flexibility. It also has greater opportunities for multi-benefit recharge programs like the one we're working with in the Nature Conservancy. But first and foremost, DWR is not a land use agency. We don't make land use decisions or recommendations. That's generally at a local level, but we can provide some guidance on what land uses provide the best opportunity for programs like Floodmar, what provides the greatest water management flexibility. So we're not proposing any water conservation measures. But in our water use efficiency, we have lots of guidance on how to make best decisions when using water, when using your water allocations or doing your local planning. But we provide some recommendations, but no proposals as far as land use management.
Great. So each of you presented us some really interesting solutions, whether it's on river management down in Ventura County, Sandy. Don, you've talked about how you've expanded acreage for recharge on your operation. And Jenny, you're leading a statewide effort looking at how do we expand managed aquifer recharge. How do we get there from here, given that the climate is warming, there's increasing risk of floods? What do you each see as critical actions that need to be taken at the local or state or just culturally within the population of California to get us to a point where we're thinking about these issues at a rate that's fast enough to ensure stability in our state? What are some of the key issues that need to happen? You don't have to answer it all, any one of you, but what are some things that pop to mind?
Yeah, and I'll answer mine, and I think this answers one of the questions in the chat too about
exactly.
A coordinated effort led by one agency, and DWR is one of many partners that needs to be in conversations around FloodMAR and getting FloodMAR projects implemented. They're depending on the scale of the strategy. There's lots of federal, state, and local agencies that need to be part of the conversation. And so having collaborative venues to be able to identify collective needs and opportunities and how a FloodMAR strategy might be able to provide solutions for all water sectors. And that's one of the things that we're learning in our Merced watershed study that sustainable conservation is a part of is, as I said in my presentation, we're all vulnerable to climate change, but having these collaborative solutions that can provide benefits for all of us, we all need to be at the table and having these conversations and figuring out, where we can find these solutions that could be win-win-win for many water sectors. Because for our Merced study, we're seeing that there's benefits for ecosystem, there's benefits for flood risk, there's benefits for water supply reliability, and just having the venues to have those conversations. And as you said at the beginning, we're in this collaborative era. So how do we incentivize that level of collaboration?
Don, do you want to answer some of that?
Sure. We know that, money doesn't solve everything, but it sure helps. When you're trying to build infrastructure, the cost to put these projects together is substantial. You've got local support, private support as well, to either doing matches or even just bringing a canal through their property and it's disruptive. It changes things around on your farm. There's no question. But that, and I think maybe I'm not going to be critical of the State Water Board, but I think they need to react quicker when we do have events that are forecast. Being able to get these temporary permits through in a timely manner, and maybe expanding the length of the permit to capture water that may be in a stream and available that may either be flooding downstream or available for recharge locally would be great. We always call it cutting the green tape. I mean, I look at the cost of our project and the length of time it took to get full implementation, and there was a lot of permitting, a lot of agreements that had to be in place before we could move one shovel full of dirt. So,
Don, a related question that ties to your comments there. You're talking about the cost, the infrastructure cost. Arthur had a question about, are there many GSAs in the valley that lack the infrastructure, as you described, for the McMullen area, where new canals need to be built? And there are a lot of irrigation districts that are part of GSAs that do have a distribution system, there's a phrase in the whole groundwater sustainability world referring to white areas, which are areas that are outside of irrigation districts. And is your sense that those areas that don't have existing water conveyance are thinking about similar projects and similar costs to what you're seeing in McMullen? Or are they taking other approaches?
I think we were probably 10 years ahead of everybody with our project. But yeah, the white areas, which are the areas the county administer, they have no irrigation district, no water district, are the ones that need it probably more than anywhere else in the state, because they don't have the infrastructure and have always relied on groundwater. In our GSA, the middle portion of it is white area. We're trying to hopefully at some point annex them into a water district, but we have 2 water districts within our region, our groundwater sustainability agency, and neither one of them have water rights. So equivalently, they're all the same as the white area. So we know that those areas that have never received surface water are the ones that probably are more critical than others.
And I'll just put a comment in here. One thing that Sustainable Conservation has been working on with Jenny and DWR is taking a look at if we do recharge where the existing irrigation district canals are now, because it's virtually free. It's it's $40 to $100 on the farm to put that water on those places and recharge it. If we use those areas and recharge there, where does that water go underground? And working together with a team of consultants, we've been able to see that when you recharge in those areas, it moves to the areas where the pumping has been going on, such as these white areas. And so we're developing our groundwater recharge assessment tool right now to help a couple of GSAs figure out, does it make more sense to invest in this new infrastructure, or is it cheaper for us to pay the irrigation district farmers to do more recharge, because that water is going to migrate underground into our area and replenish our water supply. So it becomes a cheaper water supply provision than necessarily a bunch of new canals. In your case, you were very close to the river, so it was more affordable. There's some areas that are really a long ways from any surface water. So I just thought I'd put that out there, that there are different ways to achieve sustainability.
No question, Daniel, and I think we need all options available to us. Yeah. And if you have a neighboring irrigation district that has water and the infrastructure and is willing to cooperate with you, you bet. Nothing wrong with that at all.
Sandy,
I think, sorry, I was just going to add on really quickly, if that's okay. I think some of the comments that you made, Daniel, and that Don made, really highlight the importance of flood management agencies and groundwater sustainability agencies talking and coordinating on using flood and groundwater together, and really, in those high flow events that could potentially have flood risk or damage potential, those flows are outside of the water right process. Anything that causes damages, and a lot of flood managers know what those thresholds are. So when those damaging events happen, or those high flow events happen, if there's some pre-coordination between GSAs and flood management agencies, people will be able to pull water off the system quickly and nimbly if there's already this coordination and program in place that who the diverters are, how much capacity they can take off the system, and really that's like the low-hanging fruit of FloodMar. That just takes collaboration, and also making these linkages where we can early and often. And Daniel, in your comments, you were talking about the flow of groundwater between irrigation districts, between GSAs. That's another conversation that needs to start happening, and I think they are. A lot of GSAs were focused on getting their plans developed, and as their plans are developed, they're going to have space to think about going outside and having these conversations. But our Merced study, some of the results that we're seeing on the fate of groundwater, potentially a third of recharged groundwater is leaving their basin and going to neighboring basins. So how can neighboring basins account for that additional supply, be project partners in recharge projects? So there's lots of opportunities to make these kind of connections.
Sandy, how do you answer the question of what changes are needed in our thinking about water management? I mean, how do we move forward to see these ideas more widespread?
Yeah, I mean, I think California has become so good at managing single issue water problems, right? So we solve our flood problems this way and our supply problems that way and our stormwater problems another way. And it's become so fragmented that we've forgotten that it's all one resource, right? And legally, our groundwater is completely separate from our surface water. It's like the same drop of water, but depending on where it is, totally different laws apply. And those kinds of things, I think, I look at a lot of what we need to do is kind of deconstructing and breaking down those kind of institutional, legal, social, et cetera, barriers that we've created between different ways of thinking about water and bringing them back together again, and just kind of that one water concept. So I think a lot of it is, thinking about integrating our groundwater and surface water management. It's around thinking about the flood management and our water supply issues. And I think the hard thing is that kind of Jenny's getting at is that what it requires is a lot of planning and coordination. And what we're stuck in a cycle right now is just responding to drought, right? So if you think about the last couple of years, people have been so slammed with transitioning to groundwater sustainability, getting their plans developed, trying to meet all of those regulatory requirements, trying to manage through drought conditions, trying to manage through I forgot the pandemic, right? Of course, there's the pandemic also. I mean, there's all of these things, these cascading things that, like, if I had a magic button, I would like to hit pause and just give everyone a little bit of breathing room to kind of like get this sorted out, to have the conversations that are needed to be had, because I think a lot can come through those through collaboration if we bring all of our problems to the same discussion and then look to a solution that does more than one thing. But it is a different mindset, right? Because the original mindset was, you are responsible. Hey, you, Groundwater Sustainability Agency, you're responsible for groundwater sustainability. They're not responsible for land use. They're not, there's all these things that they're not responsible for that they can say not it. And if we continue to think about the problems in that way, we're not going to get to these integrated solution set. So I think some of it is just like these mental blocks, or these kind of governance, sticky governance things and barriers that we've created for ourselves that we really need to start breaking down.
That's great, thank you. One question came up around water rights. We've touched on that a little bit here. Jenny, you just spoke about the distinction between floodwaters where water rights is not needed. I don't want to get into a deep legal discussion about water rights, because I think the audience will start checking out. Some folks will stay on, I'm sure, but for the conversation. But in terms of water rights, one of the things that's happening right now is all these groundwater sustainability agencies are realizing that securing surface water supplies, especially during flood events, is key to achieving their sustainability. The Public Policy Institute of California has pointed out that even if we captured every drop of water coming out of the San Joaquin Valley, out of the Sierra Nevadas and the San Joaquin Valley, we'd only be addressing 25 or 30% of the overdraft problem that we have. We're not gonna create enough new supply to address that. Of course, there's also solutions around bringing more water in, importing water from the northern part of the state. But even in the northern part of the state, water districts and GSAs are starting to realize the value of their water and are starting to see their own groundwater depletion and needing to save and hold on to some of that water. Anybody want to comment on sort of how much of a solution is this idea of groundwater recharge compared to the conservation questions that we've had and demand reduction?
Meaty question.
Go ahead, Jenny, go ahead. You can try.
Yeah, a lot of the PPIC data was based on annual averages. And, Floodmar is not an annual average. It's really trying to take advantage of the events when they happen. And, I'll mention the Merced study again. We're seeing through that, some years water available to use for replenishment in the system is really low, on the order of 20,000 acre feet or less. But there are other years where it's over 200,000 acre feet. And so, Floodmar strategy is not the silver bullet, but it helps build a healthier savings account when you are able to take advantage of the years that have the high flows, build that savings account for that next dry period, whether it's within the same year or, you've got carryover year to year, but, it's going to have to be an all hands on deck. All innovative solutions. Floodmar, I think, is a significant part of that, just because of the flexibility and integration it builds into the system. But, we're really talking about these years that have higher flows, and how do we take advantage of those?
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, Daniel, I mean, we know that it's not the silver bullet for everywhere, but it does provide resilience to the state. It's another way of capturing water that when it comes, usually the whole state's flooding, and really nobody has wanted this water in the past. It's been a problem. People don't want to typically flood their land with more water if they're trying to farm it. But I think knowing that sustainable groundwater management is hanging over all of our heads, and the other solution is demand management. You're limited as far as what you can pump. So anything you can do to help keep farmland in production, maybe it is a smaller amount, but I think anything we do is going to be beneficial, not just for the farms, but for the rural communities that rely on the aquifer for drinking water. Anything we can do to build this up, make better water quality happen within these regions is a real plus. So I think it's worth the investment. I don't know of a lower cost solution available right now. Maybe there will be in the future, but right now, this is it.
Don, let me ask a follow-up question on that comes from Rogel Rogers, who's Sustainable Conservation's new agronomist. One of the things that he's been hearing and that we've been hearing is for farmers considering taking water on their farms, there's a concern about declining, that their yields may not be maximized. And most of the strategies for growing crops have always been about maximum yield for the crop. And how do you think about possible reductions in yield, even if you've had to take that risk? It sounds like you haven't had much in the way of significant risks detected at all. But if you had to consider a possible yield decline, but having a water supply, how would you balance those things?
Very simply, I'd go for the additional water supply and give up a little yield. That's just the nature of farming. I think you have to weigh all your risks and benefits, and if you can keep the land producing, and if you have an investment in an orchard, you want to maintain that. You don't want to just you don't want to turn the water off on it. That's the other alternative, and take trees out of production. I've always been a believer in a balanced approach to our farming. We have less than 1/2 of the farmland in permanent plantings, in trees, in vines, and we're probably going to stick to that, because you're right. You don't want to have to take water away from a investment you've made, and just rely on, I guess, whatever you have left. So we've always been able to be flexible. If we need to cut back, we can cut back.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the trade-offs between water supply and agricultural productivity and flood control. What about the habitat benefits of these kinds of management? Sandy, let's talk some more about that, and also perhaps community benefits for the people that live in the valley. Can you comment some more about what are some of the challenges to seeing integrated planning for these floodplains? I mean, in Ventura County, you had a very progressive county and interest in that. What are you seeing in terms of expanding our river floodplains and thinking about that in the Central Valley?
Yeah, another statistic I'd like to share. So about 95% of the habitat used to be found in wetlands and along river systems in California is also gone. And so in a lot of cases where we find those little remnants of habitat are those rare places where honestly we can find space to have the habitat and water, a water supply. Thankfully, there are a number of organizations that are doing a lot of great work to protect land, and a lot of the best opportunities, especially in the valley, what we saw in Ventura County, is that the nexus of kind of the river systems and farmland, and showing places where we can bring that habitat back and restore it or remove invasive species or just protect it. So those programs, it's interesting because if you look at kind of the history of some of the areas that have intensive land protection over the habitat areas, they frequently happen right after a big flood event. So like the big 97 floods, a lot of the easements went in because people just kind of said, well, the river took it, so let's just let it go to habitat and get some funding to compensate the landowner for that. So these funding mechanisms are critically important, I think, both from the federal and the state perspective, and kind of bringing those two things together to allow farming when you can farm it, and restoration when you can't, right? Or areas that are kind of low productivity, those are also good candidates for putting them back into habitat areas. So programs that do those things, and there are a bunch of nonprofit partners out there, along with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the federal entity, and then in different counties, depending on how they're set up, there's resource conservation districts also that can facilitate those projects with landowners, and the funding sources. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it, that I think can be helpful. And I think that it does benefit folks to do these types of practices in geographic areas together, because having multiple landowners, especially along a river frontage or on both sides of the river, do these types of practices, hugely beneficial to the species that rely on that habitat. I know one thing, I'm sure, Daniel, you've heard this a lot, that a lot of landowners, for good reason, have a lot of concern about having habitat, because it could, and in a lot of cases does bring in endangered species. There's so little habitat available that the species flock to them, literally. And so it can bring those species into that habitat. There are things like safe harbor agreements that can be arranged to protect landowners, to allow them to continue to manage, to farm, to do the normal things that they've done. There have been a lot of efforts, including by Sustainable Conservation, to streamline permitting to allow these types of practices. So I think if people are interested, there's a lot of capacity that's helping both develop the science and then also the practices around helping do this in a practical way. And I think over time we're seeing the costs come down. It's always the first folks out of the gate, kind of like Don, end up paying and having to invest more because the barrier costs are high, but those have come down, I think, pretty considerably, especially with riparian habitat restoration.
I'll just also point out that the Natural Resources Conservation Service that you mentioned, which is a federal Department of Agriculture division, has, after many years of work at Don Cameron's, with Phil Bichond as the consultant and ourselves, this NRCS now is going to start funding on-farm recharge practices. And so that's another financial incentive that will be provided, and Sustainable Conservation is helping the NRCS figure out how to administer that program and roll it out. In terms of other funding programs, this is an important piece. In the dollars that are available right now that we see from the state, as well as the federal government, how integrated or how flexible do you all think those funding programs are to recognize the need to link flood management with recharge, with habitat restoration? Or are they still focused on that single purpose that you mentioned earlier? Are we seeing integrated funding programs, or does an individual farmer or irrigation district have to go after 3 or 4 different grants to address these different needs?
A lot of times there is kind of the adding different grants together for different purposes, but I think we've started to see a shift in programs that have multiple benefits. One great example is the Central Valley Tributaries program that is administered out of DWR's Division of Floodplain Management. Groundwater recharge is a fundable benefit under that program. They've got a pretty lengthy list of multiple benefits that could be funded through that program. I think within different agencies, we're kind of building our programs to be multi-benefit, but it's between the different agencies and trying to have better alignment and trying to marry up what can be funded across the different agencies. And also, a lot of local agencies are confined to, spending within their jurisdictions. And a lot of times, benefits might be far afield, or a project, could be out of your district, but have a lot of benefit to your district, specifically for flood control projects and thinking of large scale flood mar. So we still need to do a better job of having rainbow colored money instead of single purpose money that could be more broadly spent across watersheds.
Daniel, I think we still have a ways to go. We know that when we put water in a field, we attract wildlife. There is absolutely no doubt. So there is a benefit by getting water spread on land. I couldn't believe it. We have ibis, geese, ducks, everything show up. It's amazing how they find it so quickly. But, we've also looked at grants for pollinator habitat. We kind of took advantage of the canals we put in, and we're putting pollinator habitat along the sides for not only for the pollinators, but it also maintains the slope and prevents erosion. So we get multi-purpose benefits from these projects. Yeah, it'd be nice if we had, hey, you're going to put in a 5 miles of canal. Here's some extra money. Let's put some habitat in along with it while we're doing it. Not a bad idea.
There's a question that's come up twice in the chat, or in the question around Temperance Flat, which is a reservoir on the upper Kings River, which is upstream from Udon, and wondering why we're not building a new dam up there, expanding the size of existing dams. This oftentimes comes up in part of the water management question. And I think, Jenny, you pointed out that many of our dams are empty right now. And Don, as a potential recipient of Temperance Flat water, why do you think it isn't happening? What's your take on it?
Well, from what I've heard, that just financially, for the amount of water that would be developed and saved, it really wasn't practical to move forward with it. And I know they gave their money back to the State Water Commission that they had allocated. So I'm not saying that there aren't good projects in the state. I know Sites is an excellent example for off-river storage. But I think the people that were involved in Temperance Flat felt that economically it didn't make sense for the amount of water received.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour and a half, and I'm afraid there were still a few questions we didn't get to, but I want to thank all of our panelists for being with us today, for sharing your knowledge and your views on this, and really just thank you as partners for all the work we get to do together. It's really a pleasure for me to count you all as friends and collaborators. And thanks to all of you who tuned in today to this panel, and hope that you also learned and gained some new knowledge from this, and that we've answered your questions. We really do appreciate your involvement and engagement in understanding water in California. And this concludes Sustainable Conservation's webinar series for the year. And we'll be announcing our new webinar series early in 2022. In the meantime, you can stay updated on our blog or watch past webinar recordings at suscon.org/events. And many thanks again to our sponsors from Iron Horse Vineyards and Spotswood's Estate Vineyards and Winery for supporting the series. And just once again, really appreciate our panelists for taking time and sharing what your organizations and your individual motivations are in working together on these tough topics. And look forward to many years more of working on this. So thanks to everyone. And I guess we're wrapping up. I closed that a little too soon, but if there's one last question, we could take one here. Let's see. Oh, there was a question about Don, how do you drain your vineyard orchard when you're ready? Do you...
Yeah, I saw that question too, Daniel. So we turn the water off, and within 7 days, all the water either goes down into the aquifer, or it evaporates, or the vines use it, and we don't have any additional water from the flooding that we did. So there you go.
Great. Thanks for filling that 1 minute we had there. Once again, thanks to everyone. Really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. Have a good
pleasure.
afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.